I hope you guys, everybody had a nice lunch. It's not the same as being in Philadelphia and, going over to the Reading terminal or a cheesesteak place. But hopefully everybody had a good lunch and ready for the afternoon for the rest of our meeting today. We have one more agenda item that we're going to be jointly meeting with the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board. Again, for anyone who came in maybe after this morning's session, I'm going to be co-chairing with Adam Nowalski, who is the board chair for this discussion, and we are going to be discussing the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Commercial Recreational Allocation Amendment. And with that, I should have asked if staff are back. Are you guys ready to, who do we have here? We have Julia and Carson. Are you guys ready to take this on? And I know we have some commission staff as well who might be part of this discussion. But if you guys are back and you're ready to go, let's kick this off.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Julia Beatty. I'm the council staff lead for Black Sea Bass. I'm going to be sharing this presentation with Dustin on the commission staff, and then Carson's also on the line to help answer questions, and Savannah is too, I believe. We're all here, but Julia and Dustin are sharing this presentation, which should be pretty short and hopefully straightforward. So this is all related to the Commercial Recreational Allocation Amendment for Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass. During the April 2021 joint meeting, the council and the board decided to postpone final action on this allocation amendment until December of this year to allow time to further develop the recreational reform initiative to help figure out what that initiative may or may not mean for allocations. And due to the delay in final action, the council and board also agreed that additional proposals could be put forward for additional alternatives for the commercial and recreational allocation percentages. The additional proposals could be put forward by council and board members. And there was an agreement that any additional proposals should be within the existing range of allocation alternatives that were already in the document to avoid further delaying final action. So the objective of today's discussion is to consider approving the addition of any new alternatives to this amendment. So we did get one proposal that includes two different sets of alternatives that was put forward by 4 council and board members. And that the proposal itself is in the briefing materials, but I'll just very briefly summarize it here. So the proposal includes 2 proposed new alternative sets, one which would base the allocations on catcher landings data from 2004 through 2018, but it would exclude years when there was RHL overages. And then the other alternative set that's proposed to be added is basically the same thing as the first one, but with a 50-50 weighting of that approach and the historical base years, so that the base years that are currently informing the allocations but updated with new data, that would be weighted 50-50 with this new, the new data with the RHL overage years excluded for 2004 through 2018. So this slide provides background on the RHL overage years during the time period considered through the proposed new alternatives. So this new alternative set was put forward in recognition of some of the fundamental differences between the commercial and recreational sectors. So as has come up a few times over the past 2 days, for a number of reasons, it's in some ways much easier to constrain the commercial sector to the commercial quota than it is to constrain the recreational fishery to the RHL. As such, many stakeholders had concerns about fairness and equity in terms of using recent base years or recent years as a basis for reallocation, considering that the recreational sector has had several RHL overages for all 3 species over the last 15 years. So there were alternatives included in this amendment that included data from these years to inform the allocation alternative, and some concerns were expressed that those alternatives were essentially rewarding those recreational overages if those overages were informing reallocation alternatives. So the intent is to just take those years out of the calculations in this new proposed alternative set. So what's shown on the slide here is the RHLs for each species during the time period that's proposed for these new alternatives, 2004 through 2018. And then it shows harvest in the old MRIP units. And this needs to be considered in the old MRIP units because the RHLs in all of these years did not account for the new MRIP data. And red text indicates harvest that exceeded the RHL and thus a year that was excluded from the proposed new alternatives. So you can see that across these 15 years, there were 5 years of summer flounder RHL overages, 5 years of Scup RHL overages, and 8 years of black sea bass RHL overages. So this slide summarizes the resulting allocation percentages, again, using the same base years across all species, 2004 through 2018, and then excluding the years with RHL overages, which are indicated on the slide here. And then there's proposed addition of both landings-based and catch-based alternatives. So the next proposed new addition for a set of alternatives is based on a 50-50 weighting of the historical base years and the 2004 through 2018 time period with those same RHL overage years excluded. This shows similar information as on the previous slide. Again, the years excluded for each species are the same as on the previous alternative. This also includes a new column showing the historical base years. So these are the years that the allocations are currently based on, and this would use those same base years, but with the new, most current information that we have. And it's important to note that for summer flounder and black sea bass, we do not have discards data for the entire historical base year time period. So my understanding of what the council and board members who put this forward, my understanding of what they did was they just, in situations where they did not have the entire historical base year time period for discards, that they took the landings percentage and then applied that to discards or to total catch to get the catch-based alternatives. So for Scup, the entire time period can be calculated in both landings and catch. And then Dustin's going to take it over here from here to describe how we determined if these proposals were within the range of the existing alternatives.
Thanks, Julia.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Julia. And yeah, Dustin, thanks for being here with us. And if you're ready to go, go ahead. We'll take questions after you're done.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we've covered this before, but it's definitely worth going over again. So in regard to the percentage allocations, staff are often asked what exactly these percentages mean for each sector's share and in terms of their future limits. So unfortunately, we cannot precisely predict future quotas and RHLs if we don't yet have those ABCs. And that is true regardless of whether we are thinking about the current allocations or revised allocations. So yeah, commercial quotas and RHLs depend on the future biomass projections and the resulting ABCs for each species, which we didn't have for 2022 and 2023 when both we were developing this amendment and when this proposal initially came through. So these landings limits also depend on annual projections of sector-specific discards, as we've gone over just yesterday. So this is a recommendation made through the annual specifications process by the monitoring committee and usually is based on recent trends. So we also know that with these changes in allocation, we may also see modified discarding rates by sector. This can happen with changing management measures as well. So given this, the FMAT came up with the example commercial quotas and RHLs for each species that to attempt to account for this uncertainty and these changing allocation percentages. So this same methodology that was used earlier on in the process to describe impacts for the existing alternatives within the amendment has been applied to the newly proposed alternatives back in April. Next slide. So the example quotas and RHLs describe expected impacts to each sector in order to allow for a more apples to apples comparison between catch and landings-based alternatives rather than just comparing percentages, which is more of an apples to oranges comparison. So these example limits were developed using the 2020 ABCs. So it's important to note that limits would vary from this in the future depending on future ABCs. And again, commercial quotas and RHLs are affected by dead discards for each sector, which vary annually and are difficult to predict under these modified allocations. So to account for this, the FMAT developed a simple linear regression model that plotted discards against catch or landings for each of the species and each sector using data from 2004 through 2018. And so that was done so we could more accurately predict what our expected discards might be under future allocations to derive our example limits. And for all three species, past discards were positively correlated with landings, which really helped us feel like we could use this analysis. So overall, the example quotas and RHLs should be taken with a grain of salt, and actual future limits will vary under different ABCs and discarding patterns, which will be assessed again in the future. So we can also, as staff, provide updated examples based on 2023 ABCs prior to final action, which would be part of the briefing materials for the December meeting if we stay on course. Next slide. So all proposed alternatives have been preliminarily been determined by staff to be within the existing range based on comparing that resulting example quota and RHL for each option. And I'll show you this next table here to kind of look at it more visually. So this slide shows the existing allocation percentages for summer flounder labeled 1A1 through 1A7. And as you'll remember, that's the existing range that we already have in place for that final range of alternatives within the amendment. And then the new additions are labeled F1 through F4, and those are in green text here on this slide. And also for reference, the bolded text displays the status quo option, and that's 1A4. So as previously noted, we use the example quotas and RHLs to determine if the proposed new alternatives are within the range based on an apples to apples comparison of all alternatives across the catch and landings-based categories. So based on that comparison, as I've said before, all the proposed new alternatives are within that range. And just referencing back to what Julia covered earlier, F1 and F2 are that 2004 to 2018 years with the RHL overages excluded. And then F3 and F4 is that 50-50 weighting of those RHL overage years combined with the historical base periods. Next slide. So here we have the same exact table for Scup, and I won't go over everything I just said, but basically the new alternatives are here in green. And again, as you can see, when looking at the example quotas for the commercial sector and the example RHLs, you can see that they are pretty much middling between the upper and lower bounds of the existing range of alternatives. And again, 1 and 2 are those overage years excluded using the last 15 years, 2004 to 2018. And then Scup 3 and 4 is that 50-50 weighting method that we discussed previously. Next slide. And then lastly, here we have the same exact table for black sea bass. And again, the status quo option is bolded. So as you can see, at least based on this preliminary analysis, considering impacts as opposed to percentages, staff have preliminary determined that this is within the existing range. So with that, we just have one consideration for the board and council today. Should the proposed alternatives be incorporated into the amendment? And I'm happy to turn it back to you, Mr. Chair, for helping us with questions and deliberating with the board and council.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. I absolutely appreciate that. Let me see if there are any questions. I'm going to take questions first, but before I go to the board and the council, I want to ask you the question, and maybe this is for both board and council to discuss, and maybe Mike Pentney at the regional office can weigh in as well. So this amendment, how does it, so the recreational reform initiative, how does it tie into this amendment? If the recreational reform initiative goes forward, is this amendment still viable or is it still necessary? I've been getting a lot of questions about that, just via email and text messages. I don't know if anyone wants to try to tackle that question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly who that was aimed at, but just from a quick staff perspective, Mr. Chair, this is actually, yeah, very important because depending on the alternative that's moved forward with as part of the recreational reform initiative, it'll either be very closely tied to the allocations or possibly a little less so tied if we're talking about like RHL and ACL comparisons. But this is extremely important for the commercial sector, as this will basically determine their annual commercial quota. So yeah, very much important for both sectors, but I see Mike Pentony's hand up, or perhaps Julia would want to also add any additional information.
Yeah, I just think, given the discussions we had earlier, it would be good to kind of figure out kind of where this all plays together. I do see Mike Pentney's hand up, so I'm going to go to Mike Pentney at this point to see if he has anything he wants to offer. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should weigh in, but you did specifically ask if I had any thoughts. And I guess I should weigh in because I've been clear on the record for a while that encouraging the council and board to prioritize rec reform over this amendment. That doesn't mean that this amendment isn't viable or isn't important. I think it's definitely an important action of the two bodies. Incorporating the revised MRIP numbers into the allocation system in some form is important to recognize the past performance of the recreational fishery, given our new understanding of that performance, is really important to make sure that we're managing based on the best available information. But is it as important as it was when it was initiated and we really didn't have a clear understanding of what rec reform might look like? I would say it's less important. If we're serious about moving forward with one of the very good alternatives that the PDT and FMAT presented us this morning for rec reform, for a harvest control rule approach, a significant and important takeaway from that action is that the decision about what next year's recreational management measures should be is tied less to an MRIP estimate of performance last year compared to next year's RHL. What was consistent across almost all of the alternatives is that you rely more heavily on the status of the stock, the biomass relative to BMSY, the trend in biomass, and the other criteria that were described this morning. And you're less bound by a simple mathematical comparison of last year's catch to next year's RHL to determine whether measures can be more restrictive, need to be more restrictive or less restrictive. And, I think all of us that have been thinking about rec reform hope that we end up in a system where, as long as the stock status remains constant or improves, you could theoretically have a set of management measures for the recreational fishery, and you could set it and forget it, and give some consistency and stability to the recreational fishery. Potentially even setting the measures, well in advance of the start of the fishing year. So all that being said, those are some of the benefits, I think, of rec reform. But because those decisions are less tied to an estimate of last year's catch relative to next year's RHL, then the allocation between the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery, I think, is just naturally less important than if we don't move forward with rec reform and a harvest control rule approach. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that definitely helped, Mike. I appreciate that. Let's see what other members of the board and the council have to say. I've got Tom Fody on the top of my list, and then Nicola, you're next. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, I don't think you'd be surprised to basically feel I totally disagree with the regional director. I am looking at that we've been, people says, well, because we got to penalize them because they went over these years, so we take these years out. Well, we didn't go over because we basically wanted to go over. We went over because you underestimated the stock all these years. You underestimated the involvement of the recreational size of the participation, and you basically put us up to failure. And I've said that numerous times, and it's so different what I've been saying. And what you really need to do is basically set up a base quota that reflects what was actually the base. Because once we got into the rules that were put in the 90s and carried over in the 2000s, we were basically penalizing the recreational community because we had lack of data, because NIMS couldn't afford to do their job and get better data. And, I look at what happened so far. We basically gave a 49% increase to the commercial quota, and we told the recs, well, you're already going over, so we're not going to give you anything, or we're not going to allow you to expand. We are not in a good situation in the recreational fishing community. I'm looking at rec performance in the right direction, but we start off for a base that we're in big trouble. Party boats, charter boats going out of business, tackle stores going out of business. Yeah, there's been a good for the tackle industry the last 2 years because a lot of people got into fishing that hadn't been in fishing, so they had to buy new equipment. But all the people that were fishing for years got out of the thing after the rules and regulations were put in place. So we really need to find out what and do it properly, get the right split of what the quota should be between recreational. We've been dealing with Scup, where we basically got arbitrarily taking our quota away by 15 or 20% years ago because you were going to eliminate bycatch. Well, the bycatch has not been eliminated. It's still there. We're still killing a lot of fish because of commercial discards, yet we're still only 18% when we should be closer to 25% or 30%. I don't know which, but that's what the numbers should be. So we should get back to those numbers and then put the recreational initiative in place. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom. I appreciate those comments. Let me see who else I have. I have Nicola next. Nicola Meserve. Go ahead, Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to thank staff, Julia and Dustin, for presenting this today and their assistance in taking the concepts of these options and helping us come up with the allocations and the example fishery limits associated with them. And just, reiterate part of what Julia said, that, the intent here was to, take some of the major themes in the public comment on the draft amendment and try to provide some options that would address some of those comments, particularly, the difference between the quota managed commercial fishery and target managed recreational fishery and fairness issues that could arise with using the historical landings to reallocate. And then also there's a pretty clear divide between recreational stakeholder interests in more recent years and commercial stakeholder interests in more historical years. So the weighted approach, look to kind of bridge that gap, and no options to address a question in the chat box. There weren't any options in the draft amendment that did a weighted approach between historical years and more recent years. Julia mentioned how with the 50-50 weighted option, how the catch-based approach required us to kind of use a proxy for the historical base years in catch, because the discard estimates didn't exist for some of or all of those historical years. And so that pulling, the landings based allocations and using them as the catch based alternatives was had been suggested in the staff memo back in April as an approach for summer flounder. So that was where that, idea had kind of come from, to provide a reasonable proxy of what the catch-based allocations could have been in the historical periods. And we looked at, what was the difference in the percentages if you use catch or landings for those years, and they were generally off by just a percentage point or two. So it seemed like a pretty reasonable approach to come up with a catch-based weighted approach under this this option. And then I would just finish with a question, I guess, which is what is needed today specifically to incorporate these options into the amendment, if that is the will of the board and the council. Is there a motion or consensus needed? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. I'll turn to staff to see before we go there, let's go to I have Tom. So I have 3 people on with their hands up. I don't have Tom anymore. Tony DeLernia, and I'll grab my notes, Nicola, and we'll see where the direction's going. So go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this new alternative should be included in the amendment that goes forward. And the reason I say that is because it does look at both historical and current participation. If you look at what the council's decision was last week on black sea bass, historical participation by the states was a very important factor in coming out of that decision regarding black sea bass. But that decision last week was also one that represented a compromise between historical participation and the current activity. And so this proposed amendment, or this proposed feature to be included in the amendment going forward, I think is a good hybrid, is a good mixture of the two. It's consistent with the council's thinking about including both historical and current activities. I also agree with what the regional administrator just said regarding the importance of this amendment. If we are very successful in achieving the recreational reform, then the urgency of this amendment is not as great. But I think the two, both this amendment and the recreational reform combined together, go forward towards helping us manage the recreational fishery in the future. And so I think that this alternative should be included in the amendment, and I think the amendment should go forward. And I think both the amendment and reform should work together towards addressing the needs of the recreational industry. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tony. And, I would fully support the proposed alternatives that have been brought before us to be included in this amendment. Let's see. I've got a couple other hands. Dan Farnham. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for either Julia or Dustin. If we could bring up the first slide that was up, please. Yep, that was the one. You had it up there. It was the recreational landings over the time series. There you go. Yep, that's it. Do you have a similar slide for commercial landings that compares what the quota what the commercial quota was over that time series and what was actually caught or landed?
This is Julia. We don't have that readily available, but we do have something very similar in our fishery information documents. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure about like the entire time series on here, but I know for black sea bass, we haven't had any notable quota overages. For Scup, I think Scup may have been under the quota for this entire time period. And I don't know off the top of my head about summer flounder, but again, there are similar tables to this in the fishery information documents, and I think it's safe to assume that any commercial quota overages, they would not be definitely not as frequent as these recreational overages.
Yep. Thank you for that, Julia. What about underages though? Like in my mind, for the difference or the greater percentage shift, but by incorporating a 50-50 split or weighing in of the historical base years and this time series, 2004 to 2018, there must have been some significant underages in the commercial side to have the magnitude of the shift. Am I thinking right?
I know there were definitely some notable underages in the Scup fishery for some of these years. I mean, maybe on the order of like 25% in some years. For black sea bass, I don't think we had major commercial underages. We might have had some minor commercial underages. And again, I can't say off the top of my head for summer flounder what the underages would have looked like. I don't know if Dustin knows it off the top of his head, but we can we can find that information pretty easily. I just don't have it ready to go in a similar table to this.
Okay, yep, very good, thank you. How about, can I do another question, Mr. Chairman, please?
Of course, Dan, go ahead.
When Dustin, when you were explaining about how the new example limits were calculated, were they calculated the same way the example limits were for the original alternatives?
Correct.
Yep, very good. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. I just, for me, I'm looking at the percentage change, and in the only way I can come up with the magnitude of the shift in quota by going with a 50-50 weighing is that we're incorporating years. I'm assuming that the years that are excluded for both fisheries, recreational and commercial. Is that correct?
Just to clarify, are you saying excluded if there was a commercial overage of the quota?
But the years that there's a recreational overage, are you only excluding the recreational part of that, or are you excluding the whole year for the calculations?
We're excluding the whole year for both fisheries. That's correct, right, Julia? Yeah, because you wouldn't be able to have a percentage share of a fishery if we're only looking at one side of the fishery. So I'll look to Nicola to correct, but that's my recollection, that we excluded the whole year if there was an RHL overage.
Yep, very good. Thank you. All right, very good. I appreciate the answers there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dan, and thanks for your comments and questions. Let's go to, I've got Kate Wilkie, and then we'll see if anybody else from the board. I saw Greg DiDomenico's hand come up. Let's go to Kate first. Dan, if you could put your hand down, unless you have something else you want to add.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question about what's up in front of us right now. I don't understand. Well, okay, this is an old MRIP currency. Would the number of overages be the same if we were using new MRIP? I'm just wondering why we're looking at old MRIP numbers, and I'm curious if, it looks like maybe half the years there was an exceedance for black sea bass, and I wondered if that would be the same in the new currency.
I'll take that one.
Yeah,
This is
I mean, that's a
Julia.
great question. Julia, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to answer that? But I mean, if you want to, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, up to you. I can answer it, or
Go
you can
ahead.
answer.
No, I'd rather you answer it than me. That's fine.
Okay. So the reason that we have the old MRIP here is because none of these RHLs accounted for the new MRIP data. So these were years when the RHLs were all set on based on stock assessments that used the old MRIP data. And if we compared those RHLs to the new MRIP data, we'd have a lot more overages than what we see here, but it wouldn't really be a fair comparison because the RHLs did not account for the new MRIP data in those years. So that's why this whole slide is in the old MRIP data.
Okay, thanks.
Is that good, Kate?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric. If you're talking, you're still on mute, Eric.
Sorry, I had to double click myself. Anyway, so.
Yeah, we hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So if I recall correctly, the reason we delayed final action on this amendment until December was to better build out or have a look at recreational reform. And this morning, of course, we had one of the most robust council discussions I've ever heard in my short time on the council, which is really impressive to me. But what was said was we are only going to get one aspect of the recreational reform initiative, and that deliverable isn't going to be until I don't know when, February, something like that. So the reason we delayed is not going to be accomplished until sometime after if we consider this amendment. Now, the question I ask myself is whether or not revisiting or realigning allocations solves the problem for the rec industry. And it does, in my mind, it does not. And, you know, whether or not you have 30% or 100% of any particular species, what kills you is your overages. That's what kills you. That's where, you know, the comments about, well, we didn't get liberalized because we already caught those fish, so we get banged for it. The statement Mr. Pentney made about the harvest control rule moving forward and set it and forget it, I mean, that's the winner for me. And if it's not a winner for anybody else, I'd be shocked. But I guess my position here is whether or not these alternatives are included. I'm assuming it's the same staff that's going to do all the work, unless there's a staff I don't know about, which will delay progress on what seems to be a pretty desirable outcome on recreational reform. The initial outcome, 1 of 6 or 7. So my position would be that we move at least on the harvest control rule and get that done. And if that has to piggyback in concert with allocation, that should come after we actually see what the harvest control rule is. It was a very complicated discussion this morning. It's a very complicated topic. And to move forward without fully understanding and developing that to reallocating, which is not going to solve the problem, I think is a fool's errand. So thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. You know, I appreciate your comment, and that's kind of where I am right now. I don't think that a delay on this amendment, I think these two paths need to be worked on in parallel to see where we end up. I mean, honestly, that's where I've talked to Chris and Wes and you know, staff. I think we need to work on these together and see where the recreational reform comes through. before we make these decisions on, allocations to the sectors. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, yeah, Chairman, I appreciate that, and I do have a comment on that. So
Go ahead.
To work
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks. I started without you. So basically, to work on them together, to work on them in concert, precludes final action on this in December, and probably until sometime. I don't know if it's in the winter. I don't know if after step one, the harvest control rule is fully fleshed out. Personally, I'd like to see more than one step in recreational reform before we talk about reallocating. I mean, we're going to get one step. It's a big step. It's a complicated step. And, if in fact, I mean, listening to you, I think you and I agree that moving them together precludes action in December on this. And I don't know if you would accept a motion on that, or how you want to handle it, Mike, but, these things have to go together. They can't have one done before the other, because one does not inform the other for sure. Changing the allocation does not solve the problem for the rec fishery. And if we did them together and the harvest control rule, set it and forget it rule went into place, I think everybody in this entire industry and this entire fishery would come out ahead. The way we're proposing to do it now, somebody's going to lose, and eventually everybody's going to lose, because you're going to end up with a strip with something that is not going to work out for you when you have to pay it back anyway. Set it and forget it. Let's move ahead together and get this thing done right.
All right, Eric, I appreciate your comment. I'm going to go to a couple other members of the council and the board, and then maybe I'll turn to staff. Maybe Chris and Bob can weigh in regarding their plans for the next few months. But let me go to, well, Julia just put her hand up. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in from the staff perspective on some of the concerns that have been brought up. So I guess the easiest thing to address is workload. Adding these alternatives in, all staff are in agreement that it would not be a major lift, because we have a process for calculating the example quotas and RHLs. We can basically just plug the we already did that, plug the allocations into a spreadsheet, and then it spits out, new numbers for that. And that's how we analyze the impacts of the alternatives already. And what we had done before, we didn't, really go through every single alternative and say, this is the impacts of this one. We kind of talk about it generally, like if you increase or decrease the allocation, it's going to have these impacts. So from that perspective, we don't think it's a major workload concern to add in these new alternatives. And we're already planning to do that, in conjunction with the further development of the harvest control rule. Like we talked about that timeline earlier today. I'm happy to pull that up again if that would be helpful, but we do think the harvest control rule timeline is ambitious, but we do think it's feasible to do these two things at the same time. The goal was to take, our understanding of the council and board's goal here was to take final action on the allocation amendment in December, and then final action on the harvest control rule might happen after that. But by December, we'll have those alternatives that we talked about earlier today for the harvest control rule. We'll have them more fully developed. We may have gotten through some public hearing process by then. We'll have a better idea of what those alternatives could mean. So even if the council and board haven't picked the final preferred alternative, we'll have a better understanding than we do now about what it might mean. And then I think the staff perspective is that there isn't an allocation alternative that's going to solve all of our problems. There isn't a harvest control rule alternative that's going to solve all of our problems, and that these things work together, and they need to inform each other. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate your thoughts on that. I do have a couple of hands that came up. I would like to wrap this up by 3 o'clock, and we have about 15 minutes. So I'm actually going to start from the bottom and go up to the top. I'm going to start with Dewey Himmelwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would be in favor of incorporating the alternatives proposed, but I would not be in favor of action on this amendment until the rec reform is further along. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Dewey. And I think that's kind of where I think a lot of people would find they would feel the same way as rec reform, develops, and this alternative, or this amendment, develops. We're going to have to see how they kind of come together. But I appreciate your comment. Thank you. Next, I'm going to go to Justin Davis, Dan Farnham. You're next, and then Tom Foti, and then we're gonna wrap this up. Go ahead, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Dewey kind of captured my thoughts in a sense that it seems like the discussion here is kind of taking two threads. One is whether or not to include these alternatives in the amendment, and then the larger question of the timing of the amendment and when we ought to consider final action. I was just going to suggest, I think Nicola asked earlier what exactly we might need here today to include these alternatives in the amendment. Do we need to make a motion? And my suggestion might be maybe we should get that motion on the board and perhaps dispense with this question of whether these alternatives should be incorporated in the amendment so we can move on to a discussion of timing if that's necessary.
Yeah, so Justin, staff put together a very simple motion. Are you prepared to make that motion on behalf of the board?
I could at this time if you're willing to entertain that now.
Yeah. I'd rather have our discussion focused on a motion than just the random comments. So that's fine. Yeah, if you can read that into the record, I'll ask for a second.
Okay, I move to approve addition of the alternatives presented today.
Okay, so we have a motion by Justin Davis. I did have a bunch of hands up. On behalf of the board, Justin's going to make this motion. Nicola Meserve, are you seconding that on behalf of the board?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And let me ask if I don't see any members of the council with their hand up. Michelle Duvall, are you going to make that motion on behalf of the council?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Joe Semino, you're the next person. You're the next person in line. So we've got a motion to debate. Let me ask if there's any discussion on the motion. I'm going to go first to Justin, and then we'll go to Michelle after that. Go ahead, Justin. Do you have anything else you want to offer as to rationale?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start out real quickly by just acknowledging the other folks who worked on this proposal, Chris Bat-Savage, Nicola Meserve, and Joe Semino for their excellent work in putting together these proposed options. I think these are a pragmatic response to the comments we've heard during the discussion and debate over this action. The reasonable concern raised by the commercial sector about including years in which the recreational sector went over the RHL and not sort of rewarding those overages, and also recognizing the historical access of the commercial sector to quota for these species. So I think, I view these options as sort of a response to some of the reasonable concerns we've heard through the discussion. on this amendment. As staff have noted, they're within the range of options originally included in the amendment. And we're not making a decision today that these are the preferred options. We're just making a decision that they're
Right.
reasonable and should be included in the amendment. So I think it's pretty straightforward, and I would hope the rest of the board and the council sees it that way too. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Justin. Nicola, did you have anything you wanted to offer on behalf of the board for rationale?
Dr. Davis summed it up very well. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Duval, anything you want to offer in addition to Dr. Davis's rationale?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Dr. Davis was very eloquent. Thank you.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I do. I appreciate everything Justin said, and I agree.
Okay.
But there was great concern when Nicola and I were talking at a previous meeting on bringing some additions forward. Nicola really carried a lot of water on this to get it through, and I appreciate all the hard work staff has already done. I think we got it to a point where we're not threatening to delay anything or draining staff time, and I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for getting us there.
Yeah. Okay, Joe, I appreciate that. So let me, based on that comment, let me ask Chris and Bob, or maybe if Tony's on, Chris Moore, do you see that the addition of these alternatives are going to slow things down? Or maybe Bob can chime in too. Maybe you can both just share the question.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go first, Bob. The short answer is no. Julia captured it very well. She laid it out exactly the way that staff has thought about it, and no. So this is while I have the mic, this is actually I'm a little unsettled by the conversation this afternoon, given the good conversation we had this morning. So this is a case where we can have our cake and eat it too, right? Where in fact both actions, the allocation amendment and the recreational reform package, we put on the table at the same time, hopefully, for council board deliberation in December, right? At that point, you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to move forward with the allocation amendment, or whether you have enough in the recreational reform amendment to take action, or some combination of those two, right? But we're ready to move forward with this, and I think the short answer is no.
Yeah. Okay. And so, how are you guys doing on the side of ASMFC? Bob, you guys good with this?
Yeah, I think the staff work, as Julius described really well, is not a real heavy lift to weave these in, and the harder question appears to be timing.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, that's good for everybody on the call. I have 3 hands. I'm going to start with Tom. We're going to take this up. I want to wrap this up by 3 o'clock so that we can take a quick break and then move on. I want to go to Tom Foti first, and then Justin, you're up next after Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
I have no problem adding this to the overall document. We might have put a lot of things in for people to choose to and comment on when it goes out to public hearing. So I'm not against this. What I was against, and I understand the reasons behind this, is when we say, well, we should just wait for the recreational form. And it's interesting that most of those people are speaking are basically on the commercial fishing side. I understand that because you don't want to give up quota. You haven't wanted to give up quota for 25 years. I mean, it's the same way of states trying to get quota allocated between states and how the fight goes on. But what I'm looking at is what happened when we did the reevaluation of MREPs and basically put these rec numbers out. And I have a community that's been suffering, that's basically going to bankruptcy, a lot of people. And I'm looking, and the rec reform will not address all of that. We need to start off at a fair and equitable quota that basically is based on historical data. And so these need to move at the same time. So thank you for listening to my comments.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for your comments. I'm going to go ahead and go to the public before we call the question. Greg DiDomenico, go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, just to clarify a few things if I could from staff. I'll try to be very brief. Did the staff indicate that the reallocation alternatives would not potentially increase discards in the commercial side?
Let me turn to staff to see if they have any response to that. I'm sorry. I don't know the answer.
I'm wondering if Greg could repeat the question, maybe say it again or say it differently. I'm not sure if I was following, unless Julia, you have an answer.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Greg, if you can just repeat the question.
Dustin, can you hear me?
I can, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you made some comments about these alternatives not potentially increasing discards in the commercial fishery. Is that what you said?
I'm not sure if I said that exactly, but what we did do to develop the example quotas and RHLs was compare catch and landings to discards, looking at the historical base period. And when we looked at it, landings were positively correlated with discards. But it maybe if that's what you're referring to, I'm not sure.
Okay, well, I'm not completely understanding you, but maybe you can understand me. So my concern here is that we will have an alternative that reduces our quota, increases discards, and then we will also be on the, we'll have additional discards removed from, under catch-based management. So I think that's potentially a serious problem for the commercial industry, and I completely understand what catch-based means and how you will do the specs and how the flow chart will work. But if you're going to increase our discards by lowering our quota, then you should be prepared for, we should be prepared for even lower, commercial landings because of that. So that's number one. Number two, also, if I could, Dustin, because you can hear me, did you say the importance of this amendment was because it's important because it would give the commercial guys some idea of what their quota is going to be? Is that what you said?
Yeah, just a point of clarification on the first question you raised. Looking at that historical analysis, if you're saying that landings as they go up, discards also go up. If you decreased the landings limit under that analysis that we've done preliminarily, you would expect that actually discards would go down. So I'm not sure if I agree with your first statement. And then for the second one,
Yeah, you don't have to agree.
In regards to your second question, I did say that, developing these allocations are very important for developing RHLs, commercial quotas, and then so on for the ACLs for each sector. So under the current system we have, they're definitely both important for both sectors.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that, so I can absolutely disagree with you on that. Last thing, is it possible, and this is to Dustin and to Julia, and I'm not trying to make light of this situation. This is a really important topic for the commercial fishery. But given our discussion earlier today about the harvest control rule and my being uncomfortable with that whole process, because I don't know if it's going to hold the RHLs and keep the RHLs from being exceeded, and considering what Mr. Pentony said, I throw this out for a possible alternative. And again, I'm not trying to be funny, but let's just take fluke, for example. Maybe we should have an alternative that gives the commercial fishery 60% like we have now, and then give the other 80% to the recreational fishery, because that's essentially what we're doing. It's very interesting to see that even though there are, we're exceeding RHLs, we're still rebuilding these stocks to all-time highs. So you can't have it both ways. Why don't we just leave everything alone and let the RHLs continue to be exceeded? Because obviously it's really not a problem. We've had the highest quotas we've ever had, yet we have these exceedances of the RHLs. So I'm not trying to be funny. I know that 50% plus 80% is 130%, but that's what we're doing now. So why don't you leave us intact and let the recreational guys catch the other 80%? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Greg, for your comment. I have two other hands before I come back to the board and the council. Go ahead, Mike. I've got two mics. Mike P, go ahead first.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to remind the council and the board of the legal requirements. Right now, we have a fishery management plan that does not meet the Magnuson requirements to be based on the best available science. The council and board have to remedy that. All right. How they do it is up to obviously the council and the board, but if they don't do it, either the service or some non-governmental entity is going to bring suit to make the board and the council meet the requirements of the Magnuson Act. I mean, it's that simple. I'm not advocating for any of the particular alternatives, but my point is that the board and the council has to do something, irrespective of what happens with the recreational reform initiative, to cure the problem with the current fishery management plan. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael. Appreciate your comment. The last comment I'm going to take is Mike Wayne. Go ahead, Mike. And then I just saw Megan's hand go up. Is that Megan Lapp? I just see the name Megan. So let's go to Mike first, and then I'll go to Megan. Go ahead, Mike.
Mr. Chairman, thanks. Can I ask a question to staff? Is that an order here?
Of course. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, do any of the alternatives being explored for the harvest control rule approach eliminate the need for allocation to the fisheries?
I guess I'll take that one. So under the Magnuson Act, we have to have ACLs. They don't have to be separate ACLs for the commercial and recreational sector, but we need an ACL. And the way we've done it for these species for a long time is to have separate commercial and recreational ACLs, so there's no consideration of not having an ACL for these species. And if you have separate commercial and recreational ACLs, you need a way to decide who gets what. So like I said earlier today, there's nothing in the harvest control rule that would, change the allocations at all or directly impact the allocations unless the council and board want to get rid of commercial and recreational ACLs, which would require a whole nother amendment, I'm assuming. We are still going to have commercial and recreational ACLs and need to have an allocation between them.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go next to Megan. I think that's Megan Lapp, the way you spell your name. Go ahead, Megan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. Thanks. I couldn't unmute myself quick enough before when you were asking.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Take your time.
I just want to make a comment here. I've been listening to the discussion, looking at documents, and I think the thing that stuck out to me as I was looking through the documents for this portion of the council meeting is the chart that was up there before, showing all of the years in that 15-year time frame when the RHL was exceeded under old MRIP. And what that tells me is that this allocation amendment, which was started supposedly on the basis of new MRIP numbers, that we needed to do something to address allocation because of new MRIP numbers and new overages and things like that. Based on the information that we saw today, what it looks like to me is a perpetual over-harvest situation on the recreational side under old MRIP for 15 years. For Fluke and Scup, it was like 30% of 15 years there were overages, not always small overages either, sometimes 3 million pounds over. And then with black sea bass, it was like 8 out of 10 years there was overages, sometimes significant as well. So at what point does that become a Magnuson issue? Because it doesn't look like it's a new MRIP issue. It looks like it's a real Magnuson issue that has been going on for quite some time. And I can say that from where I am sitting, to have these conversations at the same time as I have enforcement agents with guns strapped to their waists, boarding boats on docks outside of this facility, and sometimes inside this facility, examining the offloads of these species to make sure of commercial compliance. This is really extremely offensive. And I agree with Greg. If the council is going to just continue to allow recreational overharvest, well, then just keep allowing it and don't take away from commercial to make up for that. Because I can assure you from the commercial side, there will be an issue of raising Magnuson. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that comment, Megan. Does anyone have anything they want to, there was a mention of the service. Does the service have any comment back to Megan on this?
Nope.
Megan, your hand's still up. Did you have anything else you wanted to offer?
Nope, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. All right, so let me ask one more time. Is there anybody else from the public that wants to weigh in on this motion at this time? Okay, I don't see anybody's hands, so let's go ahead and bring it to let's bring it back to the board and the council. I think the council voted first on the last motion, so Chairman Nowalski, I'm going to ask you I'll ask you to call the question to the board, and then I'll call the question to the council after that.
Thank you very much. I
we
see
caucus
Mr. Reed's hand up. I was going to ask if there was a need to caucus. Was your hand up regarding that or another matter?
It was up for exactly that, Mr. Chairman.
Outstanding, but you have to stop reading my mind like that. You're going to find something you probably don't like sometime. We're going to take 2 minutes to go ahead and caucus. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
All right, I am without the benefit of the ASMFC timer, but I've got a pretty good track record not being late for dinner. So we're going to say our 2 minutes is up, and we're going to go ahead and go with the question here. Motion move to approve addition of the alternatives presented today. Is there any state or jurisdiction that has opposition to this motion? Not seeing any hands or hearing anything. Are there any abstentions on this motion? Mr. Reed, is that an abstention for the state of Rhode Island?
Yes, it is.
Okay, this motion passes the board with 1 abstention from the state of Rhode Island. Back to you, Chairman Luisi.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'll make the point that, since Mr. Reed can't vote on the council, that would have been to the state of Rhode Island. I know he appreciates that. It just makes me laugh every time. Okay, so we have a motion. It passed the board. I'm going to ask the council if there's any abstention. I'm going to follow up with Chairman Nowalski and see if there are any opposition to the motion at this point. So Dan Farnham, you are opposing this motion?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, I am.
Okay. So with opposition, I am going to, Dan, if you could put your hand down. I think for the record, it would be more clear if we asked, based on the council, for all those members of the council that want to support this motion, please raise your hand. And we'll go ahead and get those on the record. So let me ask Chris. Chris, do you want me to read the names into the record or just do a count?
Just a count.
Okay. I lost track here. It's hard to scroll with the mouse. 1, 2, 3. Did staff come up with a count?
I got 16.
Okay, that's what I got too. I just wanted to make sure because the screen was moving. It was moving really fast. Okay, so we have 16 in favor. If we can put those hands down. Thanks, Mary. I'll wait till all the hands go down. Okay, I don't see any hands anymore. Okay, all those opposed? Okay, I see 3 in opposition. Are there any abstentions? Sonny, your hand's still up. I saw you vote in opposition. So I'm going to, okay. So there are no abstentions. Motion carries 16 to 3 to 0. And I'll ask staff, is there anything else that we need to bring before this group right now?
Nope, this was all we needed today.
So we're good? Okay. I want to thank the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board. I think we're concluded. I'm going to adjourn the joint meeting, and we have some council action that we're going to be taking up over the next couple hours. And you're all welcome, very welcome to stay online, and I will certainly recognize you as, members of the management team for questions and answers, but we are going to conclude
Mike,
this
can I say
meeting.
something before we leave?
Oh, I'm sorry. Who was that?
Tom Fody, I'm a hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm not going to be present to basically see the awards and ceremony of swearing in, but would be derelict if I didn't thank Tony Delano for all his years of work on this thing. We sat through 3 terms of, 3-year terms with Tony on the council. So I really want to appreciate and wish him lots of luck in his new endeavors. And the second question I have, we are definitely not having a joint meeting at the Mid-Atlantic October meeting, because I got 2 other meetings to plan for. I'm just trying to find out what are we doing in October. So at your council meeting in New York, we're not having a joint meeting.
I'll say, Tony, well, I'm sorry, Tom, that we haven't decided what we're going to do yet in New York. We kind of waited and decided that we were going to postpone the Philadelphia meeting, kind of, just based on the situation with the pandemic. That has yet to be determined for New York. We have plans to have a joint meeting, but whether or not we're going to be in New York is up for discussion. And that's something that, Bob and Chris and I and others in leadership are going to have a discussion about. So that's where we are right now.
Thank you, because this way I can't plan the other meeting. I'll just plan on coming to the Mid-Atlantic Council, whether it's virtual or whatever. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom.
Mike, it's Tony.
Julia, did you have something you wanted to offer before we take a break?
Yeah, just related to that October meeting question, the timeline that we presented this morning for the harvest control rule would have the policy board and the council reviewing and approving a final range of alternatives and a draft addendum for public comment in October, but we haven't determined if that means it's the October council meeting or the commission's annual meeting. I think probably the commission meeting would be we might consider that because it's later in October, so it would give us a little bit more time, but just wanted to remind everybody of that there was a plan for that discussion between the council and policy board to happen at some point in October with details of what meeting to be determined. Yeah,
no, that's great. No, I appreciate that, Julia. And, we all hope that we can at some point get together again. But it's just been difficult with, especially the cities that we've chosen for our meetings. There are a lot of people in those cities, and it's just the nature of what we have to deal with right now. So no, I do appreciate that. And just to follow up with that, we will have a meeting. It just may not be in person. So everybody stay tuned. I've got 2 other hands, and I want to wrap this up very quickly. Eric Reed and Tony Delernia, then I'm going to shut it off. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, just a quick question. If we're going to have a discussion about recreational reform in October, are we also going to have a discussion about this topic at the same meeting?
Which topic are you referring to?
But right now, I think we're on commercial recreational allocation amendment, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I don't know what staff have planned for moving forward. That I'll have to turn to either Chris or staff on when the next time we're going to be discussing it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So,
yeah,
Eric,
go ahead, Chris.
we didn't plan to have an allocation discussion again until December. So the October meeting is still very uncertain, and certainly we have time to add or take off anything we plan to do for that particular meeting. So if in fact someone believes that we need to have another conversation about this in October, we can certainly contemplate that, but I haven't sat down with staff either council staff or commission staff to figure out exactly what the plan is for October yet.
Yeah, I thank you, Dr. Moore. I appreciate that. But since we have new alternatives to analyze and discuss, I thought maybe October would be a good time to have at least some information on what those would look like. And there's been some requests for other charts and pictures and photographs with a paragraph on the back of each one. So my position would be we should have another discussion about this in preparation for December. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Eric, we can Chris and I can talk about that. We can make it work. Last comment before we take a 5-minute break. I've got Tony DeLernia. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, to Tommy, Tommy, thank you very much for all your kind words. It's been a long time you and I have been sitting at the table together. But folks will no longer confuse the two heavy-set, ball-headed Italians from Brooklyn, because I had weight loss surgery earlier this year, and I'm down about 75 pounds already. So you're going to have to, people will no longer confuse me for you or you for me. Also, Mike, just so that you know, starting in September, indoor gatherings in New York City, everyone will be required to be masked again. So keep that in consideration when you make your decision for the October meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tony, I know you're going off the council, but we certainly want to keep touch with you. Just based on that information, we'll have to make a decision. And I'm so happy to hear that you've lost some weight and you're healthy and ready to take everything down. Now that you're not going to be on the council as of tomorrow. It's great. It's just great. And we'll have a little ceremony, a little time to talk about things this afternoon. But yeah, you and Tom Fody were working in fisheries management when I was in kindergarten. So, that's kind of the perspective. You brought an amazing, you and Tom both, over the years have brought an amazing, recollection of the past and the future. And so I appreciate that comment, Tony.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Tommy, I guess, is the last man standing at this point, but Wade and I will see each other again. All righty, listen, we'll talk later. I got a few things I want to say to everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we're gonna have time.
Everybody wants to take a break. Let them take their break. Everybody wants to get out of here.
Everyone wants to take a break. I'm sorry, I just hit the mute. I don't see anyone, any other hands at this time, and I'm really sorry for the
Mr.
folks.
Chairman. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can I interrupt real quickly? We're gonna have to.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, we're gonna, because of our lateness, we're gonna have to move some things around. So Sam was scheduled to present at 3:30, so we're gonna have him do that and have him go first when we get back from our break in 5 minutes.
That's fine. Yeah. Do you want to have Sam go first, and then we'll go back to the right whale stuff after that?
Yeah, so we're gonna have to check with the right whale folks. Hopefully that'll work for them. But
okay, yeah,
we're gonna go to Sam.
Chris, I'm really sorry. I try to stay on track as far as schedule goes, but this virtual situation has just made things a little bit more difficult. So yeah, if I know Sam's schedule is pretty full, we'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break. I'm going to adjourn the meeting with the ASMFC Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Board, and we'll come back in 5 minutes at 3:30 for Sam Rauch to give us a briefing on conserving and restoring America the Beautiful, which is under tab 9. Thanks, Chris. Anything else before we take a break?
That's it.
All right, seeing none. All right, seeing no hands. We'll break for 5 minutes. We'll come back at 3:30 and hear from Sam. Thanks. Thanks, Chris.